Hello, this video is going to take a look at the relationship between social identity, social inequality, and agri-food, and is the last in a series of videos looking at the relationship between community impacts and the agri-food system. So we can start by thinking about identity and inequality broadly, the experience and social imagination of food and agriculture varies quite a bit actually when we look across groups. And in the US, those groups, those dividing lines, tend to be along the lines of gender, race and ethnicity, social class, and urban and rural differences, as those tend to shape both the experiences and imaginations of agri-food. Uh, so when we think about gender and agriculture, especially, we usually our mind fills with very masculine sort of images: pickup trucks, cowboy hats, tractors, guns, chewing tobacco. Uh, Ironically, the land and farmland is often referred to as fertile, or as, in terms of feminine terms, Mother Nature. Soil is often called virgin soil, for instance, and therefore the land becomes an object for male domination. Right? Some of the observations of scholars. But masculine imagery neglects the increasingly prominent role women play when it comes to farming. And throughout most of the world, it's actually women who do most of the work. Uh, in the US, that's mainly because most farmers are rather elderly, and men tend not to live as long as women. So when the male farmer passes away, oftentimes it's the widow who takes up the responsibility for the farm. And so we actually have more women farming in the United States than men, especially in the over 65 age group, which is the largest age group in agriculture. But around the world, younger women are also heavily responsible for much of the farming activities. In terms of race, when we look at the food side of agri-food, there certainly is a racial and ethnic dynamic to food. Um, the example of eating black, for instance, or soul food as a genre of cuisine, that actually encourages conflicting views. On one hand, there are those who embrace that kind of essence of culture, black culture, and so forth. And then there are those who find that to be stereotypical and something that should be minimized or done away with. But when we go to grocery stores, we can often see the retail kind of manifestation of the ethnic elements of food, because a lot of times there's an ethnic food aisle. Uh, and there you might find, for instance, a combination of Mexican cuisine, different types of Asian cuisines, maybe some other kinds of Latin American cuisines, but that would be pretty unusual. And then that begs the question, okay, so if we have an ethnic aisle, does that mean the other aisles don't serve an ethnic group? Of course they do. I mean, everybody belongs to a racial and ethnic group. But what it does is it kind of normalizes whiteness, uh, or Western European ethnicity in particular. Ching and Creed, in their study of the U-pick phenomenon, point out the kind of insensitivity that comes with, for instance, white people who live in the suburbs, paying money to go out and pick strawberries or pick blueberries, which it's an enjoyable activity. I mean, they're not necessarily bemoaning it, but they do point out that there are people who have to make a living engaging in the backbreaking work of harvesting produce. And it's quite a sign of privilege if you actually are the one paying to do that work rather than being the one paid to do that work. So this is something that definitely raises a racial and ethnic component, not to mention a socioeconomic class component. And food certainly is itself often a symbol of you know being wealthy or a member of the elite class. Meat itself has long been a symbol of achievement. Red meats, especially because of their cost, are a form of conspicuous consumption. And the other side of that, um, veganism and vegetarianism have largely become now viewed as a privileged choice because it's a rational choice not to eat meat. Of course, many people around the world have a plant-based diet, but that's not because of a choice, that's because of necessity, because the cost of meat is so prohibitive. Uh, Individuals rely on plants because that's the only food they have to eat. So there's both internal and international class components to the kind of food that people eat and whether they have a meat or a plant-based diet. The other dimension, the urban-rural dimension, comes into play when we look at food and agriculture. Ching and Creed again, they note that food once created a cultural space for people to consider the rural and country, you know, agricultural side of things. So when people would buy food, for instance, they might consider, the farmers who produced it in the rural countryside. But as urban agriculture has begun to take off, especially urbanites are given the impression that no longer do they owe any kind of debt of gratitude to rural people because, after all, they grew their own food in the city. Of course, there's quite a bit of folly in that logic. The vast majority of the food supply is, of course, grown in rural agricultural settings. Although urban agriculture is on the rise, the amount of food that can be grown in a city pales in comparison to the amount of demand for food in the city. Something that we can actually look at the math of if you wish. Um, so this is another element to the urban agricultural food movement that has come to reinforce the urban-rural cultural hierarchy that urbanites, the urbane, tend to be viewed in a positive light, while rural rustic people are viewed in a negative light, something that we've come to call urban normativity. And traditionally, agriculture is the mainstay of rural life, and it remains the case that urban people are in fact dependent on rural agriculture for the vast majority of their food supply, something that we refer to as urban dependency. And so cutting the food tie, or at least creating the impression that somehow cities are self-sufficient, degrades the importance of rural people in the imagination, in the social imagination. And this is one of the dangers of the locavore approach to food sourcing. Um, it's one thing to invite rural farmers to the city to sell their food. It's another thing to actually have urban farmers dominating the locavore scene. Uh, so in terms of the urban-rural dimension, an increasingly urban population is getting more distant from the source of their food and the people who produce it. So this creates a kind of epistemic distance that may lead to an urban indifference to rural people, right? A lack of concern. And that's problematic because rural people are dealing with some pretty difficult conditions when it comes to agriculture and growing the world's food supply. So the notion of rural life, rural agriculture, is now falling prey to stereotypes and myths that are often quite insulting and denigrating of rural people. That's something else to consider more broadly. So those are just some of the different dimensions of social identity and social inequality that intersect with food and agriculture, and we can certainly find more, but that's enough to lay a foundation. Uh, Thank you.